Hi folks, I'm going to do another booktube tag today. This one is called the Birth Year Book Tag, and it was put together by a booktuber called Criminoli. So let's get stuck into the questions. Question 1. Have you read any books published in the year you were born? If so, what's your favourite and why? Yeah, I've read a few. 1972 is the year, which makes me 49 coming 50. I gotta say, my favourite book from the year I was born, published in the year I was born, John Christopher's Prince in Waiting trilogy. And I'm speaking specifically of the third book. There's three little books in here. This is when John Christopher, the author of The Death of Grass and the Tripod series, I think he was best when he was writing for children, and he didn't talk down to children. The characters in his novels for children are more what you'd expect from a YA novel. But I think at the time he was writing, there was no differentiation between young adult and children's fiction, so it was all just lumped under children's fiction. But very intelligently written. Adults definitely will enjoy his books for children. This is a fantasy series. The three books are The Prince in Waiting, Beyond the Burning Lands, and The Sword of the Spirits. It's sometimes called the Sword of the Spirits Trilogy because it didn't really have an official name, but the three books go together, one after another, and it's really enjoyable. When I was watching Game of Thrones on TV, it very much made me think of this, and I was thinking when I was watching it, I wish they hadn't made this. I wish they'd made the Prince in Waiting trilogy, because the setting reminded me, it's not the same story of Game of Thrones at all, but the setting reminded me very much of this. I would love to see this turned into live action television. It probably won't happen though. Strange cover, look at the image here. We've got Stonehenge, or something like Stonehenge. We've got people dressed in what looks to be something from a typical fantasy novel that looks a little medieval, but we've got this bizarrely modern weapon in his hands. All of that is significant because this may appear to be medieval Britain, but it's the future, right? And it's a story about, well, I won't spoil it, but if you like John Christopher, don't ignore this book. It is definitely one of his best. This book trilogy, rather. It's definitely one of his best. Sword of the Spirits, Volume 3 of the Prince in Waiting trilogy. The question goes on, do you have any other favourites? Yes, and I've actually got physical copies from the shelf over there of a couple of honourable mentions. So here we have, not Dune. Dune was published in 1965, but the sequel to Dune, which was Dune Messiah, was published in 1972. Looking back, I mean, I read them all pretty much back to back when I read them. When I read Dune, it always struck me as strange, the ending of it, because it really felt incomplete. And yet, there was a gap of 7 years between the publication of Dune and Dune Messiah. This volume has the first 3 novels of the 6 that Frank Herbert wrote. It's called the Great Dune Trilogy because you can pretty much think of the first 3 as a self-contained story. After that point, considerable time goes past and we have another narrative which is connected to this one, but this one contains a particular cast of characters, and I really enjoyed it. I'm sure you know all about Dune, but I'll just tell you briefly, just in case someone out there has never heard of Dune. It's a story about a planet called Arrakis, also known as Dune, which is a desert planet, but it contains a substance called the spice, which is necessary for space travel, which makes this barren planet probably the most important planet in the galaxy. But it's also inhabited by these giant creatures, these sandworms, that make getting the spice difficult. And there's an indigenous population called the Fremen, and they have their own religion. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here about politics, about ecology, and about magic even. There's a lot of different things are interwoven. The world building is really multifaceted, and you really enjoy getting into the world, but it doesn't, you know, it just throws you in at the deep end. It's not like the David Lynch movie where there's that big preamble at the beginning that tells you all these things you're supposed to know. No, the book you just are thrown right into the story, and you pick things up as you go along, which is how it should be done, really. It's the story of Paul Atreides, of the House Atreides, and the bad guy is the Baron Harkonnen of House Harkonnen. And yeah, highly recommend the whole trilogy, but of course I'm speaking of Dune Messiah, the central book of the trilogy, which can't really be thought of as in isolation. Another favourite book, this time non-fiction, is Joseph Campbell's Myths to Live By. Joseph Campbell is known for The Hero's Journey, The Power of Myth, and lots of other books. Myths to Live By. You might be wondering, well, why would I want to live by a myth? Well, that's a good question. But if you've never sort of looked into what mythical thinking is and why it's important even in the modern age, you would do well to read a little book like this. Joseph Campbell is basically an expert on myths. But if your view of myths is, well, people back then were just kind of backward and so they believed in stupid things, if that's your view, this little book might sort of change that. Because mythical thinking is important even in a scientific age, because reality is essentially too big even for science. How do I know that? Well, because you can't teach quantum physics to a goldfish. That's my way of saying all cognition is limited. No matter what creature you are, goldfish, dog, ape, human being, all cognition is limited. And this sort of hubristic view that humans have, that we're just going to come up with a neat little set of equations to account for everything in reality, that's just not going to happen, because a goldfish can't do quantum mechanics, right? So we just don't know the things we can't know. We don't know the things we can't know. Do you see what I'm getting at? The idea is reality's too big for your little brain. And that is why abstract or mythical thinking is required and is useful even in the modern day. Joe Campbell, Myths to Live By. Really worthwhile read. Okay, we're on to the next question. A little aside to that first question. If you haven't read any birth year books, which one do you pledge to read in the next 6 months, and why have you chosen it? Okay, I could ignore that if I want, because I have read books from 1972, but I'll throw a couple in anyway. I would pledge The Stepford Wives by Ira Levin, or possibly The Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. I discovered Ira Levin earlier this year, and we'll get to that later. I read Rosemary's Baby, and it was so good I just want to read more. So, Stepford Wives, obviously I've seen the movie. You all probably know the story. It's got to be a good book if it's Ira Levin. That's my way of thinking. And it's got to be a good book if it's Ray Bradbury, so The Halloween Tree. I'm sure I will read both of those before long. So now on to question 2. Have you read any books published in the year you turned 18? That would be 1990 for me. If so, what's your favourite and why? Okay, I have another physical book here to show you. And I wish I didn't have to show you this, but if I'm honest, it's my favourite book for that year. I mean, I was reading a lot of horror stuff at the time. I could pick a Stephen King one. I read 4 Past Midnight that year. It came out in 1990, but it's nowhere near my favourite book of that year. Yeah, I'm going to show you a book here in a second that has only ever been printed once in 1990. Never been reprinted. It was only printed, I'm given to understand, in a fairly small quantity. It is rare. before turning on the camera, I checked eBay to see if there were any copies of this going. And there's only one copy on eBay. That's not just in the UK. This copy was in the USA. Right? So there's only one copy anywhere on all of eBay of this book I'm about to show you. And the seller is asking $150 for it. I got lucky. I got this for about £10. That's the equivalent of about $15, say. I wish it wasn't this book. I don't want to show you this book because it's the sort of book that makes a certain type of person lose their mind, in the sense that they're going, what have you read that for? Why are you reading that? What kind of a person are you? You know? So, I guess I'm just going to have to show you this book, right? Hopefully most people have switched off before now, right? Anyway, here is the book. Favorite read, published in 1990. The Church of Satan by Blanche Barton, published by Hell's Kitchen. Pretty short little book here. Now, please bear in mind, you people out there who want to lose your minds over the fact that I own a book that looks like this. There's no such thing as Satan, and the Church of Satan would advocate that there's no such thing as Satan, right? It's okay that you believe there is, but I know there isn't, right? Satan is used metaphorically in the same way that if I called you a narcissist, I'm not saying that you believe in or worship the ancient Greek character Narcissus. You understand? This is the mythical use of a Christian character, the adversary, the accuser, right? The Church of Satan has an interesting way of looking at life. If you've been on my channel for a while, you know I'm fascinated by Anton LaVey, who kicked off that organization. I have his 5 books on the shelf behind me. This was written by Blanche Barton, who was Anton LaVey's live-in partner during the last decade or more of his life. He died in the late 1990s. And this is basically a history of that church. And I think it was written, the time it was written is important because the Satanic Panic was in full swing around 1990. Well, it was probably drawing to a close around then. And this book was, I think, in part written to address the concerns of that public hysteria about so-called satanic ritual abuse, which was, yeah, we're going to talk about this, I guess. Hang on a second. Yeah. This is the terrible, terrible book that basically was essentially the primer for the Satanic Panic. Michelle remembers, this is the first edition of it. An absolutely appalling piece of psychiatry by this guy, Lawrence Pasder. We'll get into that at another time, but the Satanic Panic was revealed and proven to be a load of nonsense. And a lot of people who just had a passing interest or even a heavy interest in the occult, who may have been perfectly ethical people, had a pretty hard time during that. So, this book, The Church of Satan, addresses that somewhat. I found it an interesting book. I found it interesting just to delve into the history of that organization. And I've read it twice, and so that's that. That's my favorite. That's my favorite read of 1990. And I kind of really like having this, although I'm an ebook fan, as I indicated in the last video. I really like having this because it's just so darn rare. I don't think I'll ever get rid of this. It's a little bit tatty. It was like that when I bought it. Yeah. It's got interesting things in it, like, you know, there's a list at the back of satanic movies. Like movies that a Satanist might be interested in. There's Alice, Sweet Alice. The Car, of all movies, The Car. I don't know why that's on it, but that old movie, The Car, starts with a quote by Anton LaVey, apparently. I can remember that, but it's not a particularly deep movie. It's just a silly movie. It's got Death Wish in it. Evil Speak. Lots of horror movies. Blade Runner gets a mention. Yep. Rosemary's Baby. Yeah. So a little list of horror movies and things. So honestly, it's just a fun book. Okay? Don't start coming round to my house with your, with your burning torches and things. I'm really a good person, I'm not evil, I promise. Okay, so that is question 2 finished for what it's worth. Question 3. Of the last 10 books you read, how many were published before you were born? What were they? Did you prefer them to the newer books? Well, I keep pretty good records on Goodreads of everything that I read. So of the last 10 books, and this doesn't surprise me because I know my own reading tastes, of the last 10 books that I read, 7 of them were published before I was born. I'm not a fan really of new literature. I don't know why, but I just like old stuff. Think sort of 1940-ish through to 1980. That's the period I do most of my reading in. So here are the books that I read that fit this category. I read Someone is Bleeding, published in 1953. That's Richard Matheson's first novel. Richard Matheson of I Am Legend fame. This is not a sci-fi or horror novel. It's essentially a crime novel, noir. It's very pulpy. It's fun. If I told you, forget that I mentioned that for a second. If I told you there was a story involving a femme fatale who may or may not have committed several murders involving an ice pick, and there is a man in the story who is besotted with her, who's trying to figure out whether she is or is not a murderer, what would you think I was talking about? If you said Basic Instinct, that's exactly what I was thinking. The femme fatale in Matheson's story is nothing like Catherine Trammell in Basic Instinct. She's totally the opposite. In fact, she's almost childlike in her character. It's kind of like a young woman who is very, very sexy, very desired by men, but has no self-confidence and is so easily led. But she may or may not have committed several murders. Yeah, it's interesting. And I do think Basic Instinct probably owes a debt to that novel, in the sense that I think that novel was probably the inspiration, in part, for Basic Instinct. The ice pick's kind of a dead giveaway. So, then I went on, but that's the one I read most recently. Before that, I read Lord of the Flies, that's 1954, by William Golding. This was a first ever read of Lord of the Flies for me, and it was brilliant. A bunch of boys trapped on a desert island. Things go awry in terms of they lose touch with the civilized side of themselves and become tribal and more primal in their ways. The characters were just fantastic in this novel, and yeah, I would give it a solid 5 out of 5. I may make a video going into more detail on Lord of the Flies. Yeah, excellent novel. Before that, I read Cloud on Silver, 1964, by John Christopher, another John Christopher novel, one written for adults. The silver of the title is Silver Island. I wondered, was the title, was it something to do with every cloud has a silver lining? No, it's nothing to do with that. It's a bit like Lord of the Flies, in fact, except it's adults. It's a bunch of rich adults who end up stuck on a desert island. And it's all about how when the old veneer goes off, the old veneer of having to always be a part of polite society, when that's stripped off, what do you become? So it's kind of like Lord of the Flies with adults, but it's also a bit like Lost. Remember the TV series Lost? It's kind of like that, because there's something really weird about the island. And it's in the title of the book, Cloud on Silver. There's a mountain peak on Silver Island, and for some reason the cloud cover never leaves it. What's up there? What's going on? And there are weird mutated animals on the island for some reason. Yeah. If you liked Lost, you'll like this one. I think it's a shame that John Christopher isn't enjoying the same popularity as the likes of John Wyndham, because he's right up there in quality with John Wyndham, I think. Maybe John Wyndham, I think, is slightly better as a writer, but I do really like John Christopher. And they're two guys that knew each other, even though John Wyndham died in like 1969 or something like that, and John Christopher died in like 2012 or something like that. They did know each other. If you watch the John Wyndham documentary that was made about his life in recent years, there is an interview with John Christopher, whose real name is Sam Youd. There's an interview with him in it. Yeah, there is a publisher called The Style Press that are now keeping a lot of John Christopher's works in print. They're actually bringing them back into print. They haven't been in print for a while. And I've got the Cloud on Silver as an ebook by The Style Press. So definitely check it out. It's not as good as The Death of Grass, but it's pretty darn good even so. And then before that I read The Wisdom of Insecurity, 1951, and The Way of Zen, 1957, both of which are by Alan Watts, my favourite philosopher. The better of the two, I think, the more accessible of the two books is The Wisdom of Insecurity. The other one, The Way of Zen, has a more scholarly side to it. If you want to learn particularly about Zen and even the origins of Zen and how it was influenced by Taoism and stuff like that, I find it interesting, but far more accessible is The Wisdom of Insecurity. It's an interesting title because if you think about what religions try to do, they try to give you security, because we are insecure. We're insecure in the sense that, we don't feel safe. Life isn't safe, so we crave safety. We want to believe that there's someone up there looking after us. Or we want to believe that when we die, it's not the end, we go on. So religions typically fill that sort of void. But Alan Watts takes a completely different direction with this, and he says, embrace the insecurity, stare it down and embrace it, and get to the treasure that may lie on the other side of that, when you're not clinging to any illusions about anything. And I'm totally on board with the way he thinks. Yeah, very much so. The Wisdom of Insecurity, highly recommended. And just before that, I read Rosemary's Baby, 1967, by Ira Levin. I had actually watched the movie for the second time in my life about a month before, but the book happened to come up on the Amazon Kindle sale for £1, so I had to snap it up, and I didn't want to just let it lie on the Kindle for half a year before I read it, because I'll end up like Michael K. Vaughan in Criminality with a Kindle full of books I haven't read. Right? I don't want to do that, so I started reading it. And what I noticed was that the movie was probably the most faithful adaptation of a novel that I've ever seen, right down to the dialogue being nearly identical in a lot of cases. The novel is better than the movie because you get to see into the head of Rosemary and what she's going through. Especially the final scene. I can't really talk about the final scene in case you don't know the story, but it's fantastic. It's quite a finale to this novel. It's a groundbreaking novel, and it was a groundbreaking film for the fact that it basically made the sort of occult bodies. I'm struggling for the term because I don't want to use the term the Satanists, because in this novel the Satanists are garden variety devil worshippers who believe in the literal existence of the devil. It's the old, that's what they are. They're the bad guys, but they're not off somewhere. You know the way Dracula's off in his castle and everything? It's not like that. They're the people around you. They're your neighbors. They're your friends. They're there. It brought the evil, if you like, closer to home than a lot of other stories were doing, and it made it really interesting. Yeah, Rosemary's Baby, check it out. It's really worth reading. The ending is, to me, hilarious. But interesting too. But it's totally bonkers. It really is totally bonkers. But it's a lot of fun. Yeah, definitely want to read more IR 11, Rosemary's Baby. And the last one, before that, I read Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. That's 1953. I've already made a video on that one. You can watch it if you wish. Suffice to say here, it's a really good first contact story between the human race and visitors to our planet. Something like, it starts something like the TV series V. And I'm sure V is derivative from this novel. Yeah. So there are the 7 that I read out of the 10. Criminale also asks, did you prefer them to the newer books? Well, the newer books that I read out of those 10, the 3 that remain, they're not really that new. One of them was Survivors by Terry Nation, which was written in the 70s. Another one was Grinny by Nicholas Fisk, which was a children's novel, children's science fiction by, what is that, maybe 1970 something, 1980 something. The only reasonably modern one was Assigned, which was a guide to the television series Sapphire and Steel, which is a TV series from the 1970s. So, you know, it's all, my head is stuck in things that are old. When I was a kid, you know, a primary school aged kid, aged about 10 or 11, I loved staying up on a Sunday night to watch The Prisoner with Patrick McGoohan. You know, those are the poignant memories of my childhood, more so than the likes of, you know, Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek and that sort of stuff. And the A-Team, yeah, I did watch all that, but, you know, the standout memories are things like the Day of the Triffids series and The Prisoner. And of course, The Prisoner was made before I was born, as far as I know. We're not at the end yet, folks. The next question, question 4, is what's your favorite movie from your birth year, and why? Okay, I went through the movie list of movies, top movies of that year. There's a bunch I could have picked. I mean, Deliverance is much better than the movie I actually picked. It's came out that year, but no, I'm not going for Deliverance. I'm going for a tacky horror movie called Horror Express, starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and actually a bit of Telly Savalas in there too. But that's Kojak. Remember Kojak? Telly Savalas. But how could a movie be bad if it has a tag team with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing? Well, maybe it could be bad, but this one isn't bad. At least I don't think so. It's about a train going through the icy wastes of Siberia, and on the train is a crate, and inside the crate is a creature in a block, a creature that has been taken out of a cave, an icy cave. So the creature is in a block of ice. It's basically a fossil. It's in a crate. They're transporting it. It's the property of the Christopher Lee character, and oh, you know the ice is going to melt, don't you? And you know it's not a fossil, it's not dead. So it pretty much probably owes a debt to The Thing from Another World, which owes a debt to the story Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. It's a really fun movie. It stands out in my mind because it was my first ever scare. And it was also my first ever experience of seeing a VHS player happening as a child. That was a new invention, that VHS, video home system. Or no, VCR player, video cassette recorder. I'm getting my terminology mixed up. VCR, video cassette recorder. Remember when they were new? Some of you do. So my uncle brought one round to the house. I was probably 5 years old or something. It's one of my earliest memories, might even be my earliest memory, I'm not sure. It depends on whether it took place before or after I started school, because I remember my first day at school. We always remember our traumas, don't we? But there we were watching this horror movie with this gadget sitting in front of the television, and the scene appeared where the train employee, whatever he's called, he opens the little window thing on the crate and looks in, and the thing that looks out at him scared me so much that I'll try and find a picture of it and put it up there just so you can see. It's going to look stupid, I know it is, but to my little 5-year-old brain this was utterly terrifying. And I can remember that. What I don't remember, but my aunt tells me, is I ran out of the house and down the street, and she said to my uncle Morris, Eleanor's gonna kill you. Eleanor being my mother, who wasn't there at the time while I was being traumatized by my irresponsible uncle, whom I loved. He was my favorite relative, because he had such a boyish way about himself, and he was into things like trains and toy trains, that is. And I saw a computer for the first ever time through my uncle, but he did that to me. And I could never watch that movie anytime it came on TV. Like, even as a teenager, like 14 years old, I'm looking at the TV guide and Horror Express is coming on that night, and I'm going, nope, not watching it. Even though I could watch like anything else that was a horror movie. Certificate 18, no problem, anything. No, I don't want to watch the Horror Express. And then finally I did watch it when I was like 16 or 17 or something. And I thought, well, big deal, you know, what a... And it almost seemed the memory, my memory had actually morphed that scene into something far more scary than it was. But that's what it's like to be a kid, you know. So Horror Express, it's now been restored in HD, and I bought a digital copy of it on Amazon there within the past year. Sat down one Saturday night with a bottle of wine and some snacks and watched it and had a great time watching it again. Such a fun movie. So, it's not superb, it's tacky, but it is fun, and it's my favourite movie from 1972. Now, what's your favourite movie from the year you turned 18, and why? Hands down, it has got to be Night of the Living Dead. Not, of course, the 1968 version by George Romero, but the 1990 remake by George Romero's special effects guy, Tom Savini, who turned director for this movie. Night of the Living Dead, of course, is the zombie movie that started it all, essentially. Not the first zombie movie ever, but it's certainly the zombie movie that started the typical modern day zombie craze of you gotta shoot them in the head, that sort of stuff. It is a classic, deservedly so. I do think the remake is better than the original. Tom Savini, I understand, hated it for a long time, and I came to understand why, because on the DVD there are extras where it shows you the effects. That it's ironic that you can put the bloodier effects in as extras, but you can't put them in the movie. Cuts were demanded, and the really good special effects, he had to snip them out of the movie. So it wasn't the movie he wanted, but it's still a really great horror movie. If you remember the original, Barbara, after getting away from her brother who's been zombified at the cemetery, she stumbles into this house, and then Ben comes along, and at that point she's just a gibbering wreck, and she's a gibbering wreck for the rest of the movie. Barbara is not like that in the remake. Barbara is kick-ass. Well, no, she's not at the beginning. She starts off pretty traumatized, but she comes out of that and she becomes a force to be reckoned with. And it's kind of funny to me, you know, the movie was made in 1990, and we're now in an era where feminism seems to think it has to redress some kind of balance, where we've got to start having females, you know, we've got to start getting the men out of the way and getting the females into these kick-ass roles, where, because they've always been denied that, you know. It's like, you can tell I'm not a feminist, can't you? But it's like, how often do we see, you know, something remade, but we got to take that male character and put a female in his place, you know, because we just have to, because you know, it's like this movie was made 30 years ago, 32 years ago now, right? It has a kick-ass female in a lead role, right? It's not the only movie that was doing it then. In fact, we could go right back to, remember Miss Peel from the Avengers? There's not the Marvel Avengers. Remember Miss Peel from the Avengers? Black and white originally. When was that made? The 60s? She was kick-ass. She was a female. It wasn't unheard of. So feminism, you know, the battle has kind of been won. You can kind of stop fighting now. You can kind of stop kicking men in the teeth now. You know, the battle has been won. Just saying. Night of the Living Dead, 1990. Great movie. Nowadays, of course, when I hear that a classic movie is being remade, I go, oh, great. Because Hollywood seems to be bankrupt creatively these days. But the 1990 version of Night of the Living Dead was not made at a time when remakes were a thing. So it was kind of a fresh thing to do that. Yeah, it really works. Fantastic movie. We are at the end. So, gosh, I've made a 38-minute movie. There's no way you've watched this long, is there? If you have, thank you. I'm supposed to tag some people. I don't know who to tag because I don't know enough BookTube people. But I do know a few author friends who might want to do this tag. So I'm going to tag Will Hadcroft, author, Philip Henry, author, Michael Reed, author. Maybe you guys want to do this tag, if indeed you've watched this far. Alright folks, take care. The sky